Well, I see our time has come. You guys ready to get started?
Mhm.
Yeah? Okay. Well, good morning. I'd like to welcome our three panelists and all of you in the audience to this session, Slavery, Resistance, and Freedom in the Margins of the Native South. We're very glad to have you here. I'm Nancy Gallman, joining you from Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon, where we honor the people whose traditional lands and waterways we occupy. Portland rests on the homelands of the indigenous peoples of the Columbia River, including the Multnomah, Wasco, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Chinook, Tualatin, and Kalapuya. Today, Oregon's location is home to at least 9 sovereign indigenous nations and more than 30 communities of indigenous peoples, with historical connections to one another and people across the Pacific Northwest. We have 3 papers by emerging scholars of the 19th century American South and West. I'm going to introduce them in the order of their presentations. Following their presentations, I will take a few minutes to share some comments. They will have a chance to respond. Then we'll open it up to the audience for Q&A. If you have a question or comment, we ask that you type your question or comment in the Q&A box to the right of your screen. Our first paper is by Brooks Winfree, entitled Enslaved African Americans as Comanche Captives on the Antebellum South Texas Frontier. Brooks Winfree is an assistant professor in the Department of History at Michigan State University, where he teaches classes on United States history, Native American history, and the history of the U.S. West. He earned his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. His research concerns interactions between enslaved African Americans and indigenous people in Texas, with particular emphasis on family, labor, violence, and settler colonialism. Our second paper is by Nakia Parker, entitled To Secure Freely to These People the Enjoyment of Their Freedom, Free Black People in the Choctaw Nation in Indian Territory. Nakia Parker is an assistant professor in the history department at Michigan State University. Dr. Parker is a historian of 19th century U.S. slavery, African American, and American Indian history. She is currently working on her book manuscript, Trails of Tears and Freedom, Black Life in Indian Slave Country, 1830 to 1866, which examines the lives of enslaved and self-liberated individuals of African and Afro-Native descent in Choctaw and Chickasaw communities in 19th century Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. Dr. Parker's research has received funding and awards from several institutions, including the Association of American University Women, the Organization of American Historians, and the Western History Association. Her work has been published in the Journal of African American History, the East Texas Historical Journal, and in the New York Times bestseller, 400 Souls, a community history of African America, 1619 to 2019. Her research has also been featured on several public history websites, including the History Channel, the podcast Teaching Hard History, and the University of Texas at Austin's 15-Minute History. Our third paper is by Christine Rizzi, entitled Decolonization Movements, Black and Native Mobility in Civil War Florida. Christine Rizzi originally hails from Florida and received her BA in both history and philosophy from Flagler College in St. Augustine. She attended the University of Mississippi from 2010 to 2019, and she earned her MA and her PhD. Her dissertation, entitled "My Feet Are Chained," explored the centrality of movement to the American colonization of Florida from the early 1800s to the 1890s. Rizzi argues that while physical stasis and settlement assumed chief importance in the early colonization of the peninsula, Florida boosters turned toward emphasizing tourism and travel to fully colonize the state. In doing so, however, settlers and investors repeatedly undermined the claims to land and movement of Black and Native Floridians. Rizzi has published her research in the Florida Historical Quarterly and currently teaches at Broward College in Davie, Florida. The book manuscript, based on her dissertation, is under advance contract with the University Press of Florida. And so, now, let's begin with Brooks Winfree.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you to everyone for being here. In February 1839, a party of approximately 100 Comanches raided the village of Wells Prairie, a small farming community in south-central Texas. At the farm of the white settler Joseph Robertson, the Comanches captured 5 enslaved African-American people. The Comanches then retreated, and a small militia formed by local residents quickly located them several miles to the north. A fight ensued, and the Comanches again retreated. Once they had left, one of the captives, an elderly enslaved African-American man, climbed out of his hiding place in a ravine and approached the militia members. The Comanches had stabbed him with a spear and left him for dead. Though they abandoned the elderly man, the Comanches retained at least 2 of the enslaved people captured that day, both boys aged 10 and 15. Eventually, these enslaved people arrived in the possession of trader James Edwards. Edwards, a white man married to a Creek woman, operated a trading post near the confluence of the Canadian River and the Little River in Indian Territory, in present-day Oklahoma. From his post, located on the trail to Texas and licensed by the Muscogee Nation, Edwards had received the captives from another group of traders, also indigenous people but not Comanches, who purchased them from the Comanches. Eventually, the enslaved boys were returned to their enslaver in Texas, Joseph Robertson. In this paper, I have attempted to understand how enslaved African American people taken by Comanches in Texas experienced their captivity. Though Comanches had elaborate captivity and slavery networks, documentary evidence of captives' experiences is extremely limited. Conclusions must be pieced together from fragmentary evidence, mostly produced by white observers, and that evidence generally only accounts for the act of capture or the moment of release. Scholars of Texas have often used a borderlands framework to understand interactions between enslaved African American and free indigenous people during the 19th century. They argue that frontier areas, like the South and Central Texas regions examined in this paper, presented a space that could offer enslaved people opportunities to effect their own freedom. According to the logic of this borderlands framework, the proximity of the free country of Mexico, the small local contingent of anti-slavery German farmers, and especially the presence of the Comanches, the most powerful native group on the southern plains, rendered this region a true borderland, where enslaved people possessed opportunities for liberation not available elsewhere. Historians often think of Native people as offering alternatives to enslavement for African Americans, and there are many such examples to support such a conclusion, including limited evidence in Texas. In maroon communities separated from settlements of white enslavers, these scholars argue, formerly enslaved African Americans and indigenous people forged relations through kinship and a shared status as marginal actors in white settler societies. Over time, as with the well-known example of the Seminoles, determining precisely who is indigenous and who is African, as well as what practices and norms of life are indigenous or African, becomes difficult. Out of their shared position, these subaltern peoples forge communities that allow for the replacement of identities of bondage and marginalization with new identities of freedom. Yet, if we center the experiences of the enslaved people taken by the Comanches that day at Wells Prairie, a different understanding of Black Native interaction emerges. Of the 5 enslaved African American people taken as captives at Wells Prairie, the ultimate fate of 3 is known, and their experience with the Comanches does not seem to indicate that their captivity was a liberating experience. I argue that enslaved African Americans taken as captives by Comanches interpreted their captivity based on their existing experiences and individual histories. As a people with a long and violent history of being stolen, enslaved African Americans likely experienced Comanche captivity as a process that ultimately reified their status, in both social and economic terms, as an enslaved person. Here, both the experiences of the elderly man and the 2 boys captured at Wells Prairie are instructive. As the militia closed in, the Comanches stabbed the elderly man and left him for dead so they could retreat. Such a choice was likely strategic. Elderly people of any background were often physically incapable of performing the strenuous labor Comanches expected from captives. Comanches also considered older captives considerably less capable of becoming Comanche. Their age, potential reduced reproductive capacity, and established ties to their previous lives made older captives generally less valuable to Comanches. Furthermore, when Euro-American forces pressured Comanches, as was the case at Wells Prairie, older captives could weigh down Comanches as they retreated. During his brief and violent captivity, the elderly man likely experienced great terror and uncertainty. In some respects, though, the Comanches' treatment of the elderly man resembled the treatment of older enslaved people in white slaveholding societies. In spite of the promises enslavers made, often in response to critique from abolitionists, to offer cradle-to-grave care for enslaved people, they occasionally abandoned elderly people and were quick to liquidate them in times of financial hardship. The lie underlying enslavers' pseudo-paternalistic guarantees of lifelong care fell in the service of pecuniary interests. For the elderly enslaved man involved, the act of being captured, stabbed, and abandoned may have only served to reinforce the vulnerable position he likely experienced as an enslaved person in Texas. The experience of the 2 boys taken from Wells Prairie also reveals an encounter with captivity that mirrored certain aspects of chattel slavery. The 2 boys experienced both an initial capture in February 1839 and at least one transfer to another group of indigenous people before they were traded to James Edwards in Indian Territory. This experience of being traded from group to group before arriving at a trader who sold them back into slavery mirrors certain aspects of both the domestic slave trade and the transatlantic slave trade. In the African trade, following the initial act of seizure, captives were often traded from place to place in the interior of the continent before finally arriving at a seaport for passage across the Atlantic. The 2 enslaved boys captured by the Comanches were unlikely to have experienced the Atlantic slave trade, but they may have recognized their experience as similar to the domestic slave trade. The historian William Kerrigan has estimated that in the south central Texas region, where the Comanches seized the 2 boys, 2 of every 3 enslaved people had endured the domestic slave trade at some point in their lives. The basic outline of the domestic slave trade, the dislocation of enslaved people from family and community, the passage of enslaved people from multiple traders and over great distances, a final sale to an enslaver, reflects the experiences of the boys seized by the Comanches at Wells Prairie. These enslaved children traveled hundreds of miles against their will, passed from the Comanches to other indigenous people, arrived at a final point of sale operated by a white trader, and returned to enslavement on their farm. If they had survived the devastating experience of the domestic slave trade before February 1839, Comanche captivity only added another layer of terror through additional forced relocations, separation from family, and commodification. Yet another aspect of captivity may have appeared familiar to enslaved African Americans taken by Comanches. A central objective of Comanche captive taking, as with the taking of captives for the Atlantic slave trade, was natal alienation. Comanches subjected captives to a lengthy and brutal process to measure their physical and mental strength, to test their adaptability to life as Comanches, and to force them to shed all signs of their former lives. Captives often endured corporal torture, including beatings and mutilations. If they survived the lengthy process, and especially if they had skills like the ability to care for horses or to communicate in English and Comanche, Comanches incorporated the captives. A final example demonstrates the precarious position of African American captives during the process of incorporation and natal alienation. In 1850, officials from the United States discovered two girls who appeared to have begun to undergo the process of physical torture that Comanches inflicted during incorporation rituals. They had arrived in the camp of U.S. Army officer Randolph Barnes Marcy from a Delaware trader who brought them in 1850. The girls were black Seminole Maroons who had been captured by Comanches earlier in the year as they traveled across Texas, hoping to finally secure their freedom in Mexico. Marcy noted that the girls had been mutilated. Areas of their skin had been pierced and scraped away, and they had been burned with hot coals. Marcy believed the Comanches had used the girls to conduct scientific experiments to determine if their dark complexion extended beneath the skin. Marcy's conclusions reflected more his apparent belief in the racial science of the antebellum period that sought to justify the institution of slavery, rather than any knowledge of Comanche captivity practices. For unknown reasons, the Comanches evidently traded the girls to the Delawares before the process of incorporating the captives had been finalized. Perhaps they showed little adaptability, or perhaps the Comanches simply believed they would sell for a high price to the Delaware trader. Though a failed incorporation process likely explains these captives' injuries, the Comanches' choice to mutilate the girls may have stemmed from their concerns about the Seminole Maroons more broadly. Comanches had attacked Seminoles before in Texas, including in 1850, when they struck groups of black Seminoles traveling through Texas, killing some and capturing and selling others. The Seminole Maroons' plan to establish a colony in northern Mexico may have threatened the Comanches' entrenched raiding network in the region. In spite of such concerns, Comanches had cooperated with Seminoles in the past and regularly traded with them in Indian Territory. In fact, they may have wished to see the completion of their colony. Given the Comanches' entrenched raiding network in Mexico, the presence of a Seminole settlement south of the Rio Grande could have just as easily provided the Comanches with yet one more site to raid. Whatever the Comanches' motivations for capturing the girls, torturing them, and trading them to the Delawares, these Seminole Maroons never made it to freedom in Mexico. Their long journey to secure their liberty, which likely began in Florida, included an excruciating removal to Indian Territory and a dangerous trek across Texas, ended with capture by a foreign people, separation from their kin, mutilation, trade to yet another unfamiliar people, and almost certain enslavement once the Delaware traders found a suitable buyer. For the young black Seminole girls in William Marcy's camp, as for the enslaved people taken from Wells Prairie in 1839, the presence of the Comanches in Texas did not offer liberation or the opportunity to establish a space that could compete with the white Texas settler society. Though enslaved African Americans and indigenous peoples successfully formed marooned communities in antebellum Texas and throughout the Americas, examining captivity provides a different, more complex understanding of Black Native relations on the antebellum Texas frontier. Enslaved people caught up in Comanche captivity likely interpreted the experience as yet another form of enslavement, forced relocation, and separation from family and community. Thank you.
Thank you, Brooks. Up next, we have Nakia Parker.
Thank you, everyone, for coming so early to our session. I look forward to our discussion afterwards and hearing Dr. Rizzi's paper as well. In 1854, Cyrus Kingsbury, a white Presbyterian missionary, and Sampson Folsom, a prominent leader and wealthy enslaver in the Choctaw Nation, wrote to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs about an important legal matter that had spanned several decades. The Beams family, composed of over 50 members, were free Black people who had resided with the Choctaws east of the Mississippi and who later joined the Choctaws in Indian Territory in 1833, 2 years after the first wave of Choctaw expulsion to the west. Over the next 20 years, the Beams family was a target for white enslavers and slave traders from surrounding slave states who sought to claim them as their property through fraudulent means. Kingsbury, Folsom, and several other friends of the family in the Choctaw Nation decided to pool their financial resources together and hire an attorney to uphold their freedom claims and to petition the federal government to reimburse the substantial costs. Emphasizing the kinship networks that the Beams family had maintained in Indian Territory, Kingsbury and Folsom declared, "It is not surprising that a family living for 60 years among the Indians and intermarrying with them should become allied and attached to an extensive connection by blood and by the bonds of friendship." A central goal of this request was to honor the wishes of deceased family patriarch William Beams to secure freely to these people the enjoyment of their freedom. William Beams spent most of his adult life endeavoring to protect his family from the precarious social world of antebellum America that did not accept the multi-generational ties of a Black Native family. He moved his family to Illinois, where he manumitted them and publicly proclaimed their freedom for all to hear, and to ensure that their legal claims to freedom would be protected. Following his death in 1829, the family made a final return to the Choctaw Nation in Mississippi. There they discovered that the world of the Choctaws, the people who had always offered their family protection, was now subject to a devastating expulsion to the west. The Beams learned that the best way to safeguard their family from the white slaveholding society that rapidly approached was to remove to Indian Territory, where they could seek protection from kin and influential members of the community. That final move, however, almost proved the undoing of the Beams family. The forces of anti-Blackness that William Beams spent his life running from finally coalesced in Indian Territory in the middle of the 19th century. The space the Beams had fled to quickly came to resemble the white settler society they left behind in Mississippi. Over 250,000 free Black people lived in the slaveholding states during the antebellum era. The majority of this population was concentrated in the urban areas of the states of the Upper South, like Maryland and Virginia. The account of the Beams family, however, illuminates a different perspective on free Black people who resided in another southern region, the Choctaw Nation in Indian Territory. This paper will discuss the experiences of free and self-liberated people in the Choctaw Nation before the Civil War. I argue that although the dominant narrative of Indian Territory defines it as a place that is geographically and metaphorically Western, for people of African descent, particularly those who lived in the 5 slaveholding nations, the region mirrored the restrictive legal and social environment, as well as the racial ideologies of white communities in the Deep South. Free people of Black and Black Native descent realized that the Choctaw Nation simultaneously served as a space of protective kinship networks and as a space of exclusion. In June 1834, Choctaw leaders wrote a constitution and formed a Republican-style government, making their nation the first of the expelled southeastern nations to do so in Indian Territory. 5 more constitutions followed from 1838 to 1860, and each contained additional laws that regulated and circumscribed the lives of enslaved and free Black individuals. For example, a piece of legislation enacted in 1841 contains 3 key provisions concerning the treatment of free Black people in the nation. First, the law required any free Black person, quote, unconnected with the Choctaw and Chickasaw blood, to leave the nation and remain away forever or be sold to the highest bidder and made slaves for life. Additionally, the law forbid both citizens, Choctaw citizens and white non-citizens of the Choctaw Nation from hiring or protecting free Black people, but provided disparate punishments for whites and Choctaw citizens. The law required Choctaws to pay a fine not to exceed $500 or to receive 50 lashes on the bare back, which was higher than the standard punishment of 39 lashes for those who could not pay. The law levied harsher punishments on white non-citizens. They were compelled to leave the Choctaw Nation. Finally, the law required light horsemen, which was the equivalent of a police force with slave patrol powers, to apprehend individuals suspected of being free, and if they met hostile resistance from the detainee, the law stated that they could kill or maim as may seem expedient. In these cases, the law declared that the burden of proof shall rest upon the Negro or master to establish the fact of such Negro or Negroes being bona fide a slave. As in the states of the Deep South, a pro-slavery, anti-Black logic undergirded these legal provisions. Yet in Indian Territory, the laws went a step beyond the restrictive policies of the Deep South in regulating the lives of free Black people. This is particularly evident in the provision of the 1841 law concerning burden of proof. Free Black people in the states of the antebellum Deep South often faced the daunting task of proving they were not enslaved. Yet Choctaw leaders expected free Black people to demonstrate that they were enslaved. This inversion of Southern legal norms burdened free Black people with yet another legal hurdle to cross in order to maintain their precarious freedom in this slave society. Importantly, it also offers a clear view of Choctaws' narrowing conceptions of who belonged in their nation. Even for Black people who could claim a degree of protection and support because they belonged in the nation, such belonging had limitations. For example, even a Black person with Choctaw kin could not hold any elective office in the Choctaw Nation. Choctaw law also prohibited the General Council from naturalizing any Black person, including a person descended from Choctaws. These limitations on belonging are particularly apparent in the case of the Beams family. The Beams had Choctaw kin and received protection from leaders of the Choctaw government. Yet, their kidnapping stemmed from the actions of their Choctaw kin, their half-brother and sister, who sold them to a white man from Mississippi named John Davis. Though the benefits of belonging to the nation ultimately resolved the saga in favor of the Beams family, that the kidnapping came at the behest of kin demonstrates the limitations of belonging to the nation as a mechanism that could offer protection to Black people. Kinship and connection to elite Choctaws could mitigate the effects of a legal system designed to restrict the lives of free Black people, but they offered little protection from the anti-Black impulses that lay within many kin networks. A final example demonstrates that free Black people in the nation, including those without kin relations, understood that their own advocacy and tenacity offered the best path to securing a future of belonging in the Choctaw Nation. The restrictive racial policies found in the Choctaw Law failed to account for several practical problems that Choctaws and others faced in the nation, including issues concerning a shortage of labor. White missionaries in particular proved willing to hire free Black people to labor in mission settings, even though these practices violated Choctaw law. Such actions angered some native enslavers and often produced contentious results. In 1844, Jacob Folsom, a prominent Choctaw slaveholder and nephew of leader Peter Pitchlynn, served as steward of Spencer Academy. And a steward was someone who handled financial matters in the mission and also supervised workers at mission schools too. Missionaries dismissed Folsom when they discovered that he appropriated school funds to support himself and his family, described by school leaders as his large stock. The federal Indian agent in Fort Smith backed this decision. Unable to find anyone to replace Folsom in the vicinity, Principal Edmund McKinney petitioned the agent for help, and the agent sent a free Black man named Oliver Ingalls to take Folsom's place. Folsom fumed when he saw Ingalls and his family at Spencer Academy. He could not understand why, this is his words, he, a Choctaw, had been discharged, ostensibly because he had too large a family. Here was a free colored man, preferred before him. Folsom appealed to his influential uncle Pitchlynn for redress. Peter Pitchlynn reminded the missionaries at Spencer Academy of the laws in the Choctaw Nation regarding free Black settlement. He threatened to remove Ingalls from his post as steward and to send the light horsemen or the police force to the school to bring both Ingalls and his family to the auction block. Ingalls, however, did not take this treatment lightly. When he heard of Pitchlynn's plans, Ingalls went to McKinney and asserted his rights. He informed McKinney that the U.S. government had put him here and it only could remove him. Furthermore, Ingalls enlisted a friend to write to the Indian agent at Fort Smith, William Armstrong, to plead his case and get permission to stay in his position as steward. McKinney claimed that in addition to Ingalls refusing to leave the Choctaw Nation, he also verbally threatened him. He attacked the character of Ingalls, describing him as not pious, profane, a mulatto, and not trusty, and a great braggadocio. We want just the opposite traits. The situation dragged on for several months until Ingalls finally relented and left Spencer Academy, but only after the missionaries gave him full compensation for the labor he and his family had performed. This account reveals the tensions in the Choctaw Nation between slavery, religion, and free and unfree labor. It also demonstrates that despite Native prohibitions against free people of color, even individuals like Oliver Ingalls, who did not possess any kinship connections with Choctaws, knew their rights and actively petitioned religious and government institutions for aid in protecting them. Oliver Ingalls, like the Beams family, lived in a space, an Indian territory, that was created to facilitate, not to replicate, the development of a slave society in the Deep South. Yet the legal policies, the social environment, and the limitations of kin-based networks demonstrate that the ideologies of the slaveholding South penetrated into this space traditionally seen as Western. In February 1861, in a move that likely seemed unsurprising to any free Black person who had ever resided in the Choctaw Nation, the Choctaw General Council passed a series of resolutions that said in part that in the event a permanent dissolution of the American Union takes place, we shall be left to follow the natural affections, education, institutions, and interests of our people, which indissolubly bind us in every way to the destiny of our neighbors and brethren of the Southern states. Thank you.
Thank you, Nakia. Our final presenter is Christine Rizzi.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed those papers. I was just wrapped up. Thank you so much, first of all, to the conference organizers for transitioning this whole conference over to virtual so quickly, but also so well. Thank you also to my other panelists for your incredible work sharing that with us today. Thanks especially to Nakia for organizing this panel. Thank you also in advance to Dr. Gallman for her incisive, what I'm sure will be incisive comments, and for getting up so early on the West Coast to join us. Before I get started, I just want to briefly acknowledge that I'm living in South Florida, which are lands claimed traditionally by the Seminole tribe of Florida. And we are very thankful to have them still as stewards in this region for our natural resources. So, one of the most enduring popular depictions of Florida's pre-tourism history is Patrick D. Smith's novel, A Land Remembered. The novel follows the McIvies, a pioneer family who, through hard work and grit, rise from modest beginnings to wealth and power via their sought-after Florida land holdings. Smith portrays the McIvies as salt-of-the-earth farmers who develop deep personal connections with Black and Native people, also eking out a living in wild Florida. This work of fiction, which still commonly appears in public school curriculums throughout the state, obscures the incredibly violent methods through which settlers acquired Florida's land and natural resources in the 19th century. Indeed, like other popular works of Florida history, it frames white Floridians as intrepid pioneers rather than colonizers claiming dominion over native lands and Black labor. Identifying American expansion in Florida as colonization instead brings to the foreground the land theft and violence which undergirded the process of national expansion in the South. American military forces and settlers did not expand onto unclaimed lands. Instead, they invalidated the land claims of Native communities and used force to remove them. The violent nature of colonization also ensnared African Americans, particularly in the growing Cotton South. Black families' labor, space, and physical bodies were claimed as necessary resources by settlers eager to make their fortunes. Numerous historians, of course, have laid bare the connections between cotton agriculture and Native removal in the Southeast, especially within the field of Native South studies, which focuses primarily on the experience of Native Southerners in the process of American colonization of the region. My work explores how mobility functioned as both a tool of colonization for white settlers and a method of resistance for colonized peoples. The diverse landscape and communities of Florida made the southern state a unique arena for employing and refining racialized concepts of mobility and stasis. White Americans prided themselves on their ability not only to move freely, but also to settle new spaces in the process of colonizing North America. These settlers, however, categorized autonomous non-white mobility as inherently harmful to Euro-American expansion. For Black and Native peoples, mobility figured as a method to both survive and resist being colonized. Native and Black Floridians used their own forms of movement and consumption of natural resources to undermine American colonization. Florida's gradual colonization forced these categories of race and movement into sharp relief as Natives, Blacks, and Whites competed to exercise their agency on the landscape. Wars of removal aimed at the Florida Indians, coupled with pervasive Black resistance via movement and escape, ultimately led to Florida's secession from the United States in 1861, after only recently achieving statehood in 1845. In the 16 intervening years between statehood and secession, white settlers began to doubt the commitment of the federal government to their colonizing cause in Florida, despite the government having waged the nation's most expensive Indian war on settlers' behalf and offering them generous land grants. Secessionists in Florida clamored for a regime change that would privilege settler demands and bring non-whites to heel. The Civil War in Florida was essentially a contest over who would get to determine the future of settler colonization, the Confederacy or the United States. The experience of the war in Florida, however, powerfully disrupted white rootedness and forced Confederates to flee Union-occupied cities and towns on the coast. It also enhanced the ability of African Americans to escape their bondage, move freely, and wield their martial capabilities in opposition to white supremacy. The efforts of Florida Confederates and United States officials to pursue an alliance with Native communities in the Everglades also augmented the Seminole Indians' claims to movement, trade, and authority in the peninsula. Through their use of physical mobility during the Civil War, Native and Black Floridians struck a blow against settler supremacy and colonization in a fiercely contested space on the margins of American power. Though Florida only experienced one major battle during the Civil War, namely the Battle of Olustee in February of 1864, the peninsula did experience a persistent naval blockade and periodic instances of U.S. occupation. Occupation of coastal towns and the approach of the U.S. Army or Navy terrified Confederates, who often fled into the interior rather than face perceived abuses at the hands of the Federals. The movement of settler households into the interior had the consequence of also disrupting the sense of racial order in the state. The movement of enslaved members of settler households allowed Black men and women to escape their bondage and return to American-occupied territory. It also undermined white settler power over property and people, thus weakening settler supremacy in the midst of war. Samuel Fairbanks and his enslaved workers, John and Frank, provide a prime example of the chaos that sometimes resulted from this forced movement. Fairbanks, one of Jacksonville's most prominent residents, moved his household slightly west to Clay County during the first occupation of the city in 1862. John and Frank, upon seeing freedom in the form of Union boats, conspired to go back to the town. Though they were initially captured and jailed, quote, sympathetic sailors, end quote, broke down the jail and smuggled the men aboard a gunboat. According to historian Daniel L. Schaefer, John eventually joined the 1st South Carolina Loyal Volunteers, the unit that would eventually become the 33rd USCT. John and Frank took advantage of the disruptive nature of the movement out of Jacksonville to earn freedom for themselves and, in John's case, to fight for the freedom of other enslaved Black Southerners. John's example brought white fears of Black retribution to frightening reality. Confederate General Joseph Finnegan did not take Black escape lightly. The flight of enslaved men and women to American-occupied areas, quote, will suffice to corrupt the entire slave population of East Florida, according to Finnegan. Finnegan believed that Florida's future rested upon a controlled non-white population, especially one that remained in strictly defined areas. Finnegan also surmised that Black people worked together to free as many enslaved people as possible. In the spring of 1863, he lamented that there existed, quote, a communication network between Negroes within Union lines in East Florida and the slaves behind Confederate lines, end quote. They carried messages to one another, quote, through the swamps and under cover of the night, according to Finnegan. In March of 1863, Finnegan tasked Confederate Captain John J. Dickinson with moving, quote, into the interior all free Negroes and any without apparent owners, end quote. Florida's Confederates clearly feared the potential consequences of having so many freely moving Black men and women in the state. They could induce other enslaved Black people away or help the United States Army, thus weakening the racial order sought by Florida's Confederate settlers. Individual enslavers likewise bemoaned the loss of their enslaved workers, blaming the United States Army for carrying them off. When the Navy conducted raids along the Peace River in southwest Florida in 1864, residents grew indignant that enslaved men and women went with them. One Tampa woman stated that when Union boats left the city, they, quote, took all the Negroes they could, end quote. Another settler in the Choctaw River area in the panhandle of the state emphatically charged that Union soldiers, quote, did not ask the Negroes if they wanted to go, end quote. According to this observer, the soldiers simply, quote, ordered them to hitch up the teams and make ready to go, end quote. White settlers could not fathom that Black men and women would willingly go with the enemy, despite the fact that enslaved people had time and again attempted to escape their bondage prior to the war. Black movement indeed comprised one of the most important motivations for secession in Florida. Yet, white slave owners grew incredulous when Black men and women exercised their mobility to flee to Union safety. Some sailors and soldiers even took it upon themselves to help refugees establish their own communities in Florida. According to Schaefer, captains of Union gunboats outside Jacksonville established a refugee community on Batten Island. This community of freedmen rankled the largest slave owners in the area, including Samuel Fairbanks, who predicted that corn harvests in the area would suffer due to the lack of laborers. S.W. Godin, commander of the Mohican, took a number of contrabands from Florida and resettled them on St. Simon's Island in Georgia. Godin swore that, quote, 1,000 blacks could be usefully employed here and made self-supporting. Such a colony, properly managed, would do much good, end quote. To be sure, the example of a self-sustaining community of freedmen would accomplish many goals for the Union war effort. It would entice more enslaved individuals to flee to Union lines, and it would showcase the work ethic of a maligned and degraded population. For African Americans, though, especially those from Florida, the colony would serve as a direct antithesis to the Confederate settler colony of Florida. White Americans took control of Florida to prevent self-sustaining communities of non-white people and to prove white superiority through control of the landscape. Successful freedmen communities negated the assumptions which grounded white settler colonization in Florida. American soldiers may have used the settlement and arming of Black men as a psychological blow to settler fears in Florida, but refugees performed other valuable services to Union forces and Unionists in Florida. In doing so, these Black Floridians upset several conventions concerning mobility and race in settler colonized Florida. Escaped enslaved people who fled to Union lines augmented the fighting forces of the Army. But beyond their fighting skills, they also provided information on the Florida landscape and helped U.S. forces navigate the state. According to slavery historian Larry E. Rivers, Union forces at Pablo Creek outside Jacksonville relied upon an escaped slave named Israel for guidance. The men found Israel, quote, thoroughly acquainted with all of the country, knowledge that they sorely needed. Indeed, non-white people accumulated knowledge of their natural surroundings as a matter of survival. Black men and women used such information to abscond, find family, and enhance their personal autonomy. It is not surprising that they would then provide such knowledge to white individuals that they viewed as providing emancipation. The Civil War sowed chaos in Florida, fostering the movement of white and Black people for various causes. On the periphery of the war, however, the Florida Indians tried to recover from the hardships of two devastating wars. The Second Seminole War, waged from 1835 to 1842, forced the movement of Seminole communities deep into the Everglades of South Florida. War again broke out between these native groups and the federal government in 1855 and lasted until 1858, just on the eve of what would become the Civil War. Native Floridians, wary of any interaction with white settlers and government officials, clung to the isolation of the Everglades and attempted to conserve their resources and populations. But the Civil War once more thrust the Florida Indians into the crossfire of settler politics. The Confederate and American armies, desperate to placate the native groups in Florida, promised resources and influence in an attempt to avoid hostilities from 1861 to 1865. Confederate efforts to placate the Seminole Indians began in January of 1861 due to fears of a secondary Indian war in the midst of an impending conflict with the United States. Theodore Bissell, a chairman of the Committee on Indian Affairs in the Florida legislature, stated that although he estimated the native population of the state, quote, from 1 to 200 men, end quote, so fairly small population, it would be, quote, good policy, end quote, to ensure that, quote, these Indians should be kept quiet and undisturbed as long as possible, end quote. Officials took a conciliatory approach via trade, thus suggesting some recognition of native authority and power in the region. Settler cattle ranchers in the area reported that the Seminoles wanted to avoid war but were in desperate need of supplies. Confederate Governor John Milton thus tapped John Griffin to promise the Seminoles that legal restrictions on native trade, except for the limitations on alcohol and firearms, would be lifted. The state's Committee on Indian Affairs pushed for the legal recognition for the Indian trade in November of 1862, with new chairman Cyprian Jenkins linking the expansion of trade to Florida's overall war effort. Legitimizing trade would alleviate the threat of, quote, raids upon our unprotected frontier, which would only, quote, add to the horrors of the present war, end quote. Indeed, the Florida Indians could acquire the resources they needed, including farming equipment, ammunition, cloth, and other materials, quote, either from the state of Florida or from the abolitionists, referring to the United States Army, according to Griffin. Confederates in Florida thus viewed amicable relations with Native communities as a calculated war aim. Sanctioning the Indian trade, however, meant sanctioning Native travel to and from trading posts. Seminole Indians would have to travel out of their hidden communities in the Everglades to reach trading posts on either coast. This recognition of Native movement and trade in Florida marked a decided shift in settler policy. Whereas Seminole movement elicited American military violence before the Civil War, Florida officials now condoned Native mobility during the war. Amid Confederate attempts to woo the Florida Indians, the United States tried forming their own alliances with Native groups in South Florida. The Union blockade of the Florida coastline, harbors, and inlets brought them into contact with Native communities intending to trade, especially at forts and arsenals. Federal occupation of these fortifications and the Army's regulation of trade in the region meant that Seminole people could interact with American forces when they desired. The United States occupation of Key West for the duration of the Civil War meant that Union-affiliated traders and merchants had easy access to Native bands in South Florida, a fact that rankled Confederate officials in Florida trying to prevent a Seminole Union alliance. Union sympathizers hiding in the remote wilds of South Florida traded with Native people, providing them with needed ammunition for hunting. The United States Army also recognized that providing resources to the Seminoles gave them the upper hand in an isolated region with difficult terrain. To be sure, the United States Army had plenty of reason to develop favorable relationships with Native groups who repeatedly demonstrated their command of the landscape. The Union could potentially profit from trade and information provided by Native people. Much like interaction with Confederates, Native Floridians' relationships with the Union Army demonstrated the consistent reach of Seminole power in mid-19th century Florida. The United States Army's relationship with the Florida Indians was complex, but there is reason to believe that this relationship was more successful than that of the Confederates due to the racial policies of the Federal Army. The United States Army, of course, existed as a perennial enemy of Native Floridians over the course of the Seminole Wars. Seminole Indians inherently distrusted the federal government due to its policy of removal. Indeed, prior to secession, the United States invested millions of dollars and issued various pieces of legislation to enhance settler colonization of Florida that ultimately desired to displace Native Floridians. The racial politics of the United States in the Civil War, however, seemingly impressed some Florida Indians. When a band of Miccosukee Indians visited the garrison at Fort Myers in 1864, they were reportedly struck by the sight of Black soldiers. The Union's drive for emancipation aligned with the role of Black people in Seminole history and society. Indeed, according to Michaela Adams' research, a small number of people of African descent still lived within Seminole society during and after the Civil War. Though the Seminoles had enslaved some Africans and African Americans, Black people existed as crucial, though unequal, members of indigenous labor systems, society, and culture in Florida. The possibility of intermarriage also meant that some Florida Indians were biracial in ancestry, though communities desired to regulate this practice in order to maintain a distinct Indian identity. The exigencies of survival after the Second and Third Seminole Wars also allowed Black people to take on different roles in Seminole society. Rather than living in separate but allied Maroon communities, the Black men and women who remained with bands after 1858 lived closely with the people who claimed them as either slaves or kin. It is possible that Union emphasis on emancipation and the incorporation of Black soldiers into units mirrored Native Floridians' ideas about the role that Black people could play in society, leading the Seminoles to view the Union Army as friendlier to Native society than originally supposed. For their part, the Florida Indians used the contest between the Confederacy and the Union to enhance their own autonomy and sovereignty in the region. They played one side off of the other, dispensing information alternately to both sides in order to gain whatever concessions they could. Groups bereft of resources maintained cordial yet guarded relationships with both forces in order to extract needed materials. Native bands no doubt engaged in selective information sharing with either the United States or Confederate armies. In one instance, James McKay received word from one Seminole leader that his band avoided federal troops at all costs. Even one of McKay's associates, however, doubted the veracity of this statement. He found himself surprised that, quote, the Indians had not paid a visit to Fort Myers, end quote, in order to get desperately needed supplies. As mentioned earlier, the Miccosukee band who visited Fort Myers stated that they felt deceived by the Confederates and wanted to develop a stronger relationship with the Union Army posted there. These instances of selective friendship with the United States and the Confederacy not only promised resources, building relationships with either side concurrently enhanced the physical autonomy and sovereignty of Native groups in Florida. The Union and Confederacy negotiated with these groups as though they were prominent powers in the region and sanctioned their movement and use of resources. These interactions thus augmented the idea of Native sovereignty and belonging in Florida, even if briefly and superficially. Violence and warfare thus characterized the colonization of Florida, a far cry from the daring yet sympathetic experience conveyed by the fictional McIvies and their benevolent relationships with the Black and Native peoples surviving in their midst. Indeed, settlers routinely attacked non-white peoples for their mobility and physical autonomy. The chaos and rupture of war, however, allowed Black and Native Floridians a chance to loosen some of the constraints on their physical movement and claims to resources. These challenges to the full settler colonization of the peninsula, however, proved all too fleeting. Emancipation, as a result of U.S. victory, led to the freedom of Black Floridians, but their labor and movement would once more come under the control of settlers with the demise of Reconstruction. For the Florida Indians, the outcome of the Civil War seemed almost inconsequential, as both sides proved determined to diminish Native claims on the peninsula as much as possible. Importantly, though, the indigenous communities in Florida after the war did not experience forced removal from the state, despite the many decades of attempts at removal beforehand, owing largely to their ability to use physical movement to their advantage. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine, and thank all of you for these excellent presentations. I really enjoyed reading these engaging papers that ask us to rethink the histories of people of African descent and indigenous peoples who, in the middle of the 19th century, remade two regions of the Native West, Texas and Indian Territory, and Florida, into a new Native South before and during the Civil War. These changes, they argue, were rooted in contests over slavery, freedom, and mobility. How African Americans experienced slavery in Comanche, the lives of free and self-liberated persons of African and African indigenous descent in the Choctaw Nation, and the movements of enslaved persons, Seminoles, Black Seminoles, and Miccosukee as they reclaimed territory and strengthened their political sovereignty in Florida. In his paper, Brooks Winfree takes us to the Texas borderlands in the 1830s and 50s and explains how African Americans taken captive by Comanches did not necessarily find indigenous captivity a path to liberation. Instead, he argues, African Americans were held in a familiar form of bondage, subject to violent kidnapping, family separation, torture, commodification and recommodification, and sale, all of which, Winfree states, quote, mirrors certain aspects of both the domestic slave trade and the transatlantic slave trade, end quote, through which Europeans and their descendants established chattel slavery in other parts of the South. Importantly, he mentions the role of Comanche incorporation protocols, a ritual, and as Winfree explains, violent practice that separated captives from their older social connections in the process of bringing them into Comanche society. Given the complexity of indigenous captivity practices in the South during earlier historical periods, this raises a couple of interesting questions. Were people of African descent integrated into Comanche life as enslaved laborers? Or were they adopted as kin? Elaborating on the nature of Comanche incorporation would help us understand the extent to which African Americans taken captive ever joined the Comanche's core kinship networks, or remained outside those networks in some state of freedom or unfreedom. In Nakia Parker's paper, we see similar issues related to Indigenous traditions of transforming outsiders into members of society or enslaving them. Parker points to the consequences for African Choctaw social relations when Choctaw family members and political leaders adopted racialized ideologies and laws that oppressed both enslaved people of African descent and free African Choctaw kin. The Choctaw Nation, Parker argues, became a site of protective kinship networks and racial exclusion that affected people of African descent regardless of labor or kinship status. Multiple Choctaw constitutions and laws, she explains, regulated the lives of free and enslaved people of African descent with racial exclusions, police-like patrols, and bans from public office, including persons with Choctaw kin. The story of the Beams family and their petition makes these tensions clear and exposes the paradox at the center of Parker's argument. William Beams was not just securing his family's enjoyment of freedom generally, but their enjoyment of freedom within the Choctaw Nation. How to accomplish this? Under the constraints of the Choctaw constitutions and laws that excluded people of African descent without kin relations, while also curtailing the freedom of people of African descent with family connections, like the Beams, and exposing them to kidnapping by their own family members. Were there deeper divisions among the Choctaw concerning the practices of slavery and incorporation? And do these divisions complicate an understanding of the Choctaw Nation as a slave society? The Beams were neither enslaved nor entirely excluded as free persons. Parker shows us how, in the mid-19th century, the Choctaw continued to adapt their kinship practices to the changing social and political landscape, making it possible for the Beams to inhabit a new space within the Choctaw Nation, a new kind of freedom that might have kept them in the nation without allowing them a full experience of belonging. Finally, in Christine Rizzi's paper, we learn how Seminoles, Miccosukes, and people of African descent resisted state and local policing of their movements. The Civil War in Florida, she argues, disrupted white settlements, enhanced opportunities for people of African descent to escape slavery, and mobilized indigenous power. When white families abandoned their plantations, people of African descent reclaimed coastal areas as their domains. And as both Confederate and Union leaders cultivated alliances with them, the Seminoles and Miccosukes were able to demonstrate their strength as sovereign powers in Florida. Rizzi's paper reminds me of the great book by Stephanie Camp, Closer to Freedom, and her analysis of mobility as a form of resistance in the plantation South. How enslaved people subverted the constraints on their use of physical space by moving themselves, things, and information in rival geographies that challenged the authority of slave owners, whose large-scale systems of surveillance and control sought to contain the lives of the people they enslaved, especially women. Rizzi broadens our perspective on mobility by analyzing it at the intersections of indigenous, and African American histories in the 19th century South. Were there rival geographies in Florida's native South before or during the Civil War? Rizzi also gives us fascinating insights into patterns of dual diplomacy among the Seminoles and Miccosukes in their negotiations with the Confederacy and the United States. Clarifying the relationships between the Seminoles and the Miccosukes, not only their interactions with the Confederacy and the Union, would make this analysis even stronger. To what extent did these dynamics reflect tensions among indigenous polities in Florida, in addition to, or perhaps more than, a shared strategy to assert their sovereignty against the demands of the United States and the states in rebellion? Historically, especially the first decade of the 19th century, Seminoles and Miccosukes did not always align politically in their dealings with Europeans. Did these divisions continue into the Civil War era? In the margins of the Native South, places transformed by changing captivity practices, new forms of belonging, and renewed resistance to colonization, indigenous peoples and people of African descent experienced precarity as a way of life and reasserted self-determination in new historical contexts. Sometimes, indigenous self-determination imperiled the lives and freedom of people of African descent. At other times, coinciding acts of indigenous and Africana self-determination strengthened their resistance to imperialism before and during the crisis that tested the future of slavery in North America. That concludes my comments. To all the panelists, again, I want to say thank you for your presentations and for challenging us to think more deeply about the complex indigenous and Africana histories of the South and West. And at this time, I'd just like to ask you if you would like to respond or even ask each other questions about your work while the audience thinks about questions they might want to ask you about your presentations.
Well, if we'd like to go in order, I suppose, I'm happy to very briefly respond. First of all, thank you so much for your feedback, and again for agreeing to chair the panel, and greatly appreciate it. There likely is evidence that some African American captives or people who went to the Comanches voluntarily, perhaps, were eventually adopted as kin. In this paper, I focused on just a handful of very limited examples in great depth, limitations of space, and a conference paper, of course. But there do seem to be examples of both enslaved men and women who were likely adopted formally as members of Comanche society. Precisely what positionality they occupied is a bit more challenging to pin down. Scholars have demonstrated, speaking of captives most generally within Comanche society, that many of them performed roles as laborers. That was a principal focus, particularly of young children taken captives, as tending to horse herds, which were the most important part of the Comanche political economy in the middle of the 19th century. But many women, particularly young adult women taken as captives, were incorporated as secondary wives or additional wives for leading Comanche men, for men who controlled large numbers of horses, men who became wealthy in society. So it's interesting that there is certainly limited, very limited evidence of formerly enslaved people who became members of Comanche society who were not eventually traded, as the people I've discussed in the paper today. Determining their exact position in society is a little difficult, but it does seem, as I believe you asked, that it is somewhat subordinate to other members of Comanche society, but likely similar to captives of other backgrounds, Hispanic, indigenous, white. So thank you.
So, and I like to echo Dr. Winfree's comments, Dr. Gallman. Thank you for your wonderful feedback and getting up so early to chair this panel. And you're giving me a lot to think about with my research. So as far as slavery creating deeper divisions within the Choctaw Nation, we don't see the institution of slavery dividing the Choctaw Nation as it did, for example, with the Cherokee. Where there were deep factions of anti-slavery and pro-slavery folks on both sides. The Choctaw Nation, the institution actually crystallized and hardened in Indian territory. And so there were the leaders that made the laws. The General Council was generally made up of wealthy enslavers. Right? So of course they're dictating the political environment and laws of the nation. But in these laws, they also make it imperative for anyone who is a Choctaw citizen to engage with the institution of slavery, right? Or to engage in anti-Black ideology or behavior. So for example, you couldn't marry an enslaved person, right? Or there were limitations on intermarrying with people of African descent, even if they were free. There was also a law in the Choctaw Constitution that said that a Choctaw citizen could not harbor an enslaved person who liberated, or a free person. They could not hire a free person. If they did, they would be fined. Again, going back to the law about harboring liberated people, they made it imperative to report. They called them informers. If you will inform us if you see an enslaved person who absconded, and they would pay them if they captured them. And the payment would change depending on where the enslaved person was found. They were found within, I believe it was 5 to 10 miles of the original residence, and they were paid a certain fee. If it was beyond that, then they would get paid a higher amount. So there was financial gain if you adopted these kind of ideas, right? If you saw enslaved Black people as deserving to be enslaved, right? And we have indeed seen sources where there are Choctaws who decide to make their living as slave catchers, particularly during the Civil War. So while there is, you see wealthy enslavers being able to benefit more financially from the institution. They're able to have large plantations. They're able to enslave many people. In fact, they are the majority of enslavers, right? In the nation. Most people in the Choctaw Nation did not enslave people of African descent, but there were benefits if you participated in the institution in some way, and there were repercussions for you if you did not follow these laws. So of course, it looks different on the ground, right? As we see from the Beams family, as we see in other families in Indian territory too, people resisted these laws all the time. But we do see a general environment of equating enslavement with Blackness there.
Okay, yes, just echoing everybody else. Thank you so much for those comments. Those were just fabulous. And beautifully written. Responding especially to this question that you offer, Dr. Gallman, of perhaps these playoff politics may have more to do with internal divisions within these Native groups. This is something that never really occurred to me, and I think that's really important because yes, there is. Right, to this day, we see this division play out between Seminole and Miccosukee people, that they will eventually separate in the 20th century as they have differing ideas about to what extent should these communities be involving themselves with white society, with the government. And yes, that these distinctions between these communities had been around since the early 1800s, that there are certain bands that identify as Miccosukee. And I think, so part of that toughness of getting to this question has to do with, number one, that there really isn't at this time especially in the mid-19th century, an understanding necessarily of like overarching like Seminole identity versus like Miccosukee identity, right? So, but definitely there is this distinction between language groups and communities. And so it's been difficult to sort of get at those identifiers in the sources, because so much of the sources that I'm using right now are, of course, from settler perspectives. So they're not as concerned with the distinction between like who is Seminole and who is Miccosukee. So I think that this question really pushes me to consider digging a little bit deeper and seeing if I can perhaps identify, like, even perhaps in these mediated sources, is are there just certain groups that, because of the way that they position themselves within native South Florida, like, are they just kind of like, well, that group over there is going to the United States, and we have also like always kind of traditionally held them as different. They're a different clan. They do what they do. We're going to do what we do for ourselves. I think that that's a really important question that I have not done enough work to uncover. So I really appreciate that as an extra avenue of research. Absolutely.
Well, thank you. And Christine, I just want to say I'm grappling with the same questions as well. So this is my chance to say, I wonder what, other people think about this. Well, we have time now to take some questions and comments from the audience. Again, you can type your question or comment in the box to the right of your screen, and I will read them and go from there. So I see a couple of questions here. I'm going to start with Justin Rogers' comment. He says, "Great papers, everyone. I enjoyed listening to them all." A question for Nakia. Your framing of Indian Territory as Southern is intriguing. Could you discuss more about how you see it as Southern versus Western, and do those distinctions matter?
That is a great question. Thank you, Justin. Yeah, I'm thinking not only of geographically, right? When we think of Oklahoma, it usually, which was former Indian Territory, it usually gets painted as this Western, right? A part of the American West. And also thinking of ideas of Western as far as fluidity, right? Particularly borderland scholarship, and thinking of the West as a place of fluid relations, as a place of contestations of different sovereignties, as a place of confluence of different peoples, white folks, indigenous people, Black people. So in that case, we could say the Indian Territory is a bit Western. But when we look at certain racial ideologies, the laws of the Choctaw and even the Chickasaw Nation, it appears very Southern, right? Their embrace of the institution of slavery. For example, unlike the Creek and the Seminole and the Cherokee during the Civil War, where there were factions that the nations were split apart because, in part, because of their support for the Confederacy. We really don't see that with the Choctaw, and I will even add the Chickasaw nations. We do not see that type of contestation or that type of pushback against the institution of slavery. The Choctaw and the Chickasaw right away was endorse the Confederacy. And we do see different pro-slavery factions in other places too, like the Cherokee and Creek, but we really see it in the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations. And I would also agree with Kristen, why these distinctions matter and why it's important is when we think about after emancipation and Reconstruction, right? If we're looking at Indian Territory, and for my research, specifically the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations as a Southern place, then the fact that all these nations joined the Confederacy is not surprising to us. The fact that there are Jim Crow laws in Indian Territory, the fact that there are lynchings of Black people in Indian Territory, the fact that there are cultural manifestations like minstrel shows in places like the Chickasaw Nation after emancipation, the fact that there are vagrancy laws, right? That mirrors a lot of what we see in the Jim Crow South. And so I think it expands our idea of what we think about Reconstruction as well. We sometimes paint Indian Territory for Black people fleeing from the South, right? We paint it as this place of racial paradise, right? Where they were able to gain some freedoms and land that they wouldn't necessarily gain in the South. But for the people that were already there, facing these different lynchings, Jim Crow laws, Black codes, they probably would view it as very much like the South, what we consider the South. But thank you for your question. I think, yeah, I'm wrestling with that now. I so wanted to paint Indian Territory as this borderlands and more confluence, and in some spaces it's there, but I'm increasingly seeing it's a bit different.
I wonder if I could follow up on that a little bit, because you mentioned in your paper toward the end how these were spaces created to facilitate, not to replicate, the development of a slave society in the Deep South. And I wonder if there's any connection, though, to this pattern of civilization movements, right? Where even before the era of forced relocations and coerced migration, that societies like the Choctaw were under a lot of pressure to adopt these slave society practices in order to demonstrate their compatibility with the racialized slavery practices, institutions of the new United States. So are they carrying that those pressures and those decisions to adopt this new kind of slavery practice with them into the West?
That's a good question. That's part of it. And you have to remember too, when they're expelled to Indian Territory, they're surrounded by slave holding states, right? Arkansas, Texas as well. Some of the Choctaw enslavers who are making the laws, who are on the council, also have ties still to white enslavers in Mississippi, whether they have married people from places like Mississippi and Alabama, or whether they're doing business with them. There are certain enslavers that are sending cotton to New Orleans. We also see quite a few Choctaw as well as Chickasaw people who marry people like white Texans, and they either stay in Indian Territory or move to Texas, and they're still having business and social interactions. So there are connections there, but yeah, it's also a reaction to the federal government's assault on their sovereignty. I would definitely say that, in some reason that, well, if we can adapt as best as we can while keeping our sovereignty, we'll do that. And for some folks, that manifests as a support of slavery. Certainly not all, but yes, we cannot take out the pressure, the extreme pressure that all Indian nations in the South, as well as in other areas too, felt with the federal government, and want native dispossession and disrespect of sovereignty. We can't take that out of the equation.
Great. Oh, new question from Kristen. Question for Christine and possibly Nancy. Christine, that's you. Have you come across many sources about Colonel Thomas Jessup and his Emancipation Proclamation for the Black Seminoles in Florida?
Yeah, so during the Second Seminole War, Jessup is one of the most notorious of the generals who's in charge. I think he was general at the time, maybe colonel, because you also have Colonel Zachary Taylor comes in eventually as well. But so yeah, there's a negotiated emancipation for the Black Seminoles in Florida in order to remove them. And this is actually a really important moment in the Second Seminole War, because it actually completely changes the nature of the conflict, because the Seminoles, Native communities that were fighting in that Second Seminole War, it was actually known as the Florida War at the time. which also I think gets to the fact that this is a number of communities who do not yet share tribal identity, right? They're just all different Native groups in Florida who come to be categorized as the Seminoles. But during the Florida War, so much of the fighting force of these Native communities is also African-American men, right? Or even just African men, right? Because there's so many people of African descent who are kind of held over from the Spanish period as well. So, so much of that fighting force was also composed of African or African-American men. And so this is kind of seen as a war aim of just trying to like get these communities removed, that Jessup actually says, if you remove that, we will offer you emancipation once you arrive in Indian territory. Now, I haven't done enough research myself on exactly what happens to those communities once they do remove to Indian territory. There's a huge scholarship on that, especially by Kevin Mulroy. And then it totally changes the nature of the conflict, where there's much more emphasis on dispersion and hiding on the part of those remaining Native communities, because they can't mount a major fighting force anymore. So yeah, that's absolutely something that happened during that war. Yep.
And I wanted to ask a question, Christine, too, about the way you've kind of set up this narrative in a way that suggests that Seminoles, Miccosukee, and people of African descent were operating in kind of distinct areas. I could be reading the paper incorrectly, but I just had the sense that people of African descent were kind of negotiating space in one part of Florida, and Seminoles were negotiating in a different place. But you also mentioned the presence of people of African descent in Seminole society, and I'm just wondering whether or not there were differences in the ways that these different communities of people of African descent were using mobility to resist colonization. So not just the diplomatic relationships between Seminoles, Miccosukee, and these U.S. Americans or Americans in rebellion and African Americans kind of on the coast, but thinking about people of African descent across Florida who are members of different kinds of societies on the peninsula in general. How are they thinking about mobility? You think, were there similarities? Were there kind of differences in the way they were approaching these issues?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because Florida, it's tough to kind of write about it in that time period because it is so different. Florida, of course, was split into two different Floridas actually for a very long time, East and West, and there were still a lot of regional differences within the state. Like West Florida was kind of its own animal. Middle Florida was predominantly like the cotton region around Tallahassee. So the middle Florida is kind of the crook of the panhandle, and then everything else was East Florida. And East Florida provided a lot more opportunities for African Americans. Number one, because that's where more Native communities were. But as the Seminoles kind of get pushed down into the peninsula, there does emerge like this very real kind of separation in a way, especially kind of borne out by the sources that prior to especially the Third Seminole War, you have a lot more instances of African Americans who see escape to Seminole communities as much more feasible because those communities are still sort of like in the central part of the state. That becomes less and less a reality as the Seminoles continually get kind of pushed, Seminoles and Miccosukee get pushed down into the Everglades, especially, that it doesn't seem like after, or especially during the 1850s, that's as much of a, at least in the sources that I've read, it's not represented as much that there's reports of African Americans escaping enslavement and going down to the Everglades. Instead, it's more of perhaps a movement to right out of the state, or there's much more evidence of right people getting onto perhaps ships to go elsewhere, right, escaping that way, or just temporary, brief escape. So I think that the regional variation does matter, but especially when we look at the interactions that are happening between African Americans and Native people in the state, after a certain time period, it does seem like there is like this geographical kind of separation that's taking place in the way that they're interacting with one another. Does that kind of make sense? Okay.
Thank you. Well, that concludes our session this morning. Many thanks again to our three panelists and to all of you for joining us in the audience. Take care and have a wonderful weekend.